We're live. Hello. Today I just wanted to talk about something really quick. I'm trying to stream as much as humanly possible. Um, and I think that this week I'm going to try to talk to Olive Tree. I'm going to try to do my first interview stream this week. Um, so yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Hope everyone is having a good Monday. But today I wanted to talk about history. Before I get into that, I want to say that I've had a lot more people reaching out to me, which is awesome. Bears, in particular, whether it's getting in for music and trying to collaborate musically and collaborate on this and that. And I have been collaborating way more with a bunch of people on so many things, and it's just the coolest, you know. And that's kind of why I want to talk to Olive Tree live on stream this week, because I want to kind of go into the history, I guess, of how we connected, because I think it would be useful for people to hear that, particularly to hear kind of like the process leading up to making the sea shanty, for example, because there was a lot that went into it where nobody really listened, right? Like we would reach out to people to get involved, and it was harder to get people involved. And then you come up with something like that, and all of a sudden, you know, the support is just crazy and awesome. And so yeah, I think that it would be really cool to talk about the pieces that went into both the sea shanty and everything that kind of came after it, because it's led to a lot of really good things for me. It's got my name out there, and I think that, you know, people appreciate once you come up with something, right? Once you create something and put it out there, I think people really appreciate seeing the grind, right, that went into it, and understanding the grind, because everybody's working on their own thing, right? Everybody's you know, trying to harness their own potential and put it out there in the world, and it takes a long time of doing it in silence, and a lot of people quit because it's hard to fight through that. It's really hard to fight through that, being ignored for a while, and not just ignored because people are busy. I'm not saying it like it's a negative thing, but just until you prove yourself, you know, it's gonna feel like no one cares. And it felt like that for a while for me. And then all of a sudden, everyone cares. So if you just keep doing it, eventually everyone will care. And it's the coolest thing ever, seeing that transition happen. And so I really want to talk through that with Olive Tree. And then I think from there, I'll probably do more and more. I don't know if I'd call them interviews. Maybe they'll be kind of interview-ish, because I want to talk to people who create things in general, like people who have been doing it for a while and who are successful. Like my goal, one of my goals is to talk to the Critical Drinker about his new book, which I need to read first, so I can reach out to him with some fodder, I guess you could say. But I really want to go into that with people who actually put stuff out there, not just, you know, complain about things. I like complaining about things, don't get me wrong. It's fun, especially when you're just mocking it. But I also want to talk to creators, because there's a lot that I've gone through in my own journey in the creative areas, right? You don't just write 6 books like in a day. and until you get to the point of having built up that kind of creative library, or literal library, until you get to that point, you know, it's a long, quiet vision that you have to kind of set for yourself, and that's not easy to do. So the more people I can talk to that have done it, I think the more useful my time here streaming can be, because I feel like, again, for any creative, really the whole struggle is just to keep going. That said, today I want to talk about history, because I just wrote a history book. And history was never a topic in high school or college that I was particularly interested in. I mean, it wasn't, the least interesting topic to me. But maybe it's probably just because I didn't have like a class that really caught me, or a professor that really sparked my interest on that topic, that it just wasn't, the most exciting thing. And then, at college ended, and I started following people like Owen, people like, a lot of the truther type people, James Corbett. And when you hear history from a different point of view, to me, it made it more interesting, because most of what you hear, as far as historical events go, is the mainstream version of it, is one version of it. But realistically, as we can see now, especially, history what you experience in an event can mean something different to everyone, right? For example, I just saw a video today of NBC interviewing some people from Pennsylvania, and they were asking them about Patriots Day at the Capitol on January 6th. And, all the people that they were talking to, and of course NBC is trying to frame January 6th as this horrific type of, basically like Independence Day, but in like a negative way from the British perspective, right? Like it was some horrific event where all sorts of people died. It was just a big massacre or whatever. And the way that they're describing it is very odd, for someone who wasn't there, which the camera person wasn't. The way she was describing it was like, it was as if the world was ending. It was as if you were, I don't know, like you were actually watching the U.S. government fall, and it obviously wasn't, and it didn't. And so it was pretty clear even on that day when you saw a guy in a hat with horns on the top that it was a show. But again, to some people, maybe that was scary, right? To some people, maybe I think some people look at the Capitol building and they think that it's this, it literally is a hallowed place for them. It's like a religious kind of institution. And even though it's called the People's Capital, right? So we could agree to disagree on how significant it actually was. But the point is, from a historical context, one version of that gets told, right? The history books do not include, usually, for most events in history, they don't include the point of view of multiple sides, right? And if we had to guess, based on what our news says every day, the history books, as far as Patriots Day, would most likely tell the story of a horrible attempted insurrection of the U.S., an overthrow of the U.S. government. Now, obviously, we know today that that's lacking in a tremendous amount of context. And most likely, the other thing the history books just don't do is give you primary source accounts of people on both sides, if there even are, because sometimes it's all fake. And if you actually listen to the primary source accounts, they know that, right? For example, some of the only people who were actually afraid, or pretending to be, or claiming that they were afraid, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she like allegedly wasn't even there. She was in another area, right? And so sometimes people just lie. and say that they think they're going to die or something. But it's important. So this is why it's important to get, as much as possible, primary source accounts of the people who were there. Now, for me, there were two places where I really saw the relevance of that, which inspired me to write a book about COVID in particular, because in my opinion, COVID is one of the most... Describing it as the Great Reset is not accurate. Describing it as the Great Awakening is very accurate, because it didn't have the effect, I don't think. I mean, to some extent it did, absolutely. But it didn't have the effect, I don't think, that the people who collaborated on it thought it was going to have. And so, for me, it inspired me to do more research into past examples of this happening, right? Past examples of the actions of the people who collaborated on it, right? So it was pretty obvious the entire time, for example, that the CDC was lying about most everything. Like, there wasn't much that they weren't clearly trying to push a narrative on. And so I wanted more of a history on not just the CDC, but the things that the CDC alleges about history. And so I did a bunch of reading on some of these past events, such as the Spanish flu and polio and smallpox and all these things. And what you seem to find over and over again is that the history books that tell of these events do not tell you what the actual opinions of people who were there at the time were, which are not in alignment with what occurred at the time, or are not in alignment with what they're saying today in your history books occurred at the time. And that doesn't mean necessarily that what they're saying happened today is wrong, right? It's possible that there were people who were mistaken then. However, in order to piece together what was actually happening, you need to hear both sides. And if the history book doesn't present both sides, then there's something wrong with the history book, right? And so, as an example, during COVID, in order to do this kind of research, I bought the book Virus Mania. And in the book Virus Mania, probably the most interesting part of the entire book to me was a primary source account of a woman, an author at the time, who lived through the Spanish flu. And if you were to listen today, for example, to someone like Donald Trump talk about the Spanish flu, you'd hear something like an entirely different assessment of the situation, right? You would hear about hundreds of thousands, millions, 100 million people dying because of a airborne flu that came in through India, and that the world couldn't stop because they didn't have vaccinations, right? And Trump literally said that. And so I'll share that first. So let's just take a look at my book really quick. So this is Eleanor McBean. Let's see. How can I find where Trump talked about the Spanish flu? Okay, here we go. So Donald Trump says, the vaccine is one of the greatest achievements of mankind. Speaking of the current COVID shots, we would have had, this is kind of what he said, in 1917. Remember, the Spanish flu killed perhaps 100 million people. Actually, it ended the First World War because the soldiers were a lot of people don't know that because the soldiers got so sick. There were no vaccines. There was no anything. Okay, so most of that is not true, according to people who were there at the time. Now, we'll go over a quote from Eleanor McBean, who was there at the time. And just to summarize again really quick, first. So Donald Trump says that 100 million people died, which, again, from my book, it only comes from a study that occurred in the early 2000s. And it was a footnote. The study itself determined, based on whatever, again, they weren't there at the time. They're using their own assumptions to come up with these numbers a century later. But the study itself determined that most likely around 50 million people died. And then in a footnote, it said it's possible that perhaps two times that many died. That's the extent of which the 100 million number is citable. So that's like the first inconsistency. And at the time, during the Spanish flu, the number was 20 million, around 20 million. That was their assumption then. So clearly, there's not consensus. And that's why, again, you need to hear all points of view. You want to hear the guy who says 50. You want to hear the people who say 20. And if someone says 100, you want to hear them. But clearly there is just it's in question, right? And everything in history is like this. There's always a question. There's always for the most part, something that is debatable. Whenever there's a narrative behind something, especially, there is usually a question involved, and most of the time people have a dispute because, like I said, the way that you perceive a series of events, whether it's as significant as the Spanish flu or as insignificant as a conversation between you and your spouse, there can always be miscommunication. There can always be determination of what occurred that's different between two people. And like I said, if you can conceptualize that can happen between two people who are like married, for example, how can you can't even begin to kind of understand the scope of an event like the Spanish flu that is alleged to be a global occurrence, right? Putting that into context would be so much harder, and you'd have to take into consideration the words of a lot of people, the experiences of a lot of people, and you'd have to understand the context of their perception. You'd need like 600 pages and 1,600 citations, like there is in my book, Stranger Than Fiction, to kind of put all those pieces together and make your own determination, which is a determination that doesn't necessarily match, even based on what you do read. So there's a lot of layers to things that, like I said, unless you have the full picture, you can't even begin to understand. And this is why when we look at kind of what happens today, am I going to be surprised if a person who wore 2 masks every day for 2 years has a different version of what happened during COVID than me? Of course not. But if you're a person who lives in the future, who was born after this whole thing, and you want to understand what actually happened, you're going to have to hear the version that's in the history book and the version that isn't in the history book, right? And so as far as the Spanish flu goes, we can look back and we can see what real people who were there said. And you would think that to some extent, again, you use percentages here. You assign certain percentages of credibility, and you compare what's said against your understanding of other things, and you use discernment. And you're not going to be perfect, but you're going to be better off in doing that and receiving as much information as you can than if you just take what everyone assumes, because clearly, I think it should be pretty obvious to everyone after the last 2 years that what everyone assumes is not accurate or even close to accurate. That the people who have the authority and assign themselves the authority to say what is happening do not actually understand what is happening, or their intentions are not necessarily aligned with what yours are. So when it comes to the Spanish flu, this is what American author Eleanor McBean said in her book, which I cited here. So this is from my book. I cited this quote because I just find it to be one of the most interesting things I've ever read. All the doctors and people who were living at the time of the 1918 Spanish influenza epidemic say it was the most terrible disease the world has ever had. Strong men, hale and hearty, one day would be dead the next. The disease had the characteristics of the Black Death added to typhus, diphtheria, pneumonia, smallpox, paralysis, and all the diseases the people had been vaccinated with immediately following World War I. Practically, all right, hold on a second. So first of all, immediately following World War I. Practically the entire population had been injected/seeded with a dozen or more diseases or toxic serums. When all those doctor-made diseases started breaking out all at once, it was tragic. That pandemic dragged on for 2 years, kept alive with the addition of more poison drugs administered by the doctors who tried to suppress the symptoms. As far as I could find out, the flu hit only the vaccinated. Those who had refused the shots escaped the flu. My family had refused all the vaccinations, so we remained well all the time. We knew from the health teachings of Graham, Trail, Tilden, and others that people cannot contaminate the body with poisons without causing disease. Now, this should be sounding pretty wild to most people. This is, again, a direct quote by someone who lived during the time. When the flu was at its peak, all the stores were closed, as well as the schools, businesses, even the hospital, as the doctors and nurses had been vaccinated too and were down with the flu. No one was on the streets. It was like a ghost town. We seemed to be the only family that didn't get the flu. So my parents went from house to house, doing what they could to look after the sick, as it was impossible to get a doctor then. If it were possible for germs, bacteria, virus, or bacilli to cause disease, they had plenty of opportunity to attack my parents when they were spending many hours a day in the sick rooms. But they didn't get the flu, and they didn't bring any germs home to attack us children and cause anything. None of our family had the flu, not even a sniffle, and it was the winter with deep snow on the ground. When I see people cringe when someone near them sneezes or coughs, I wonder how long it will take them to find out that they can't catch it, whatever it is. The only way they can get a disease is to develop it themselves by wrong eating, drinking, smoking, or doing some other things which cause internal poisoning and lowered vitality. All diseases are preventable, and most of them are curable with the right methods, not known to medical doctors, and not all drug list doctors know them either. It has been said that the 1918 flu epidemic killed 20 million people throughout the world, but actually the doctors killed them with their crude and deadly treatments and drugs. This is a harsh accusation, but it is nevertheless true, judging by the success of the drugless doctors in comparison with that of the medical doctors. While the medical men and medical hospitals were losing 33% of their flu cases, the non-medical hospitals such as Battle Creek, Kellogg's, and McFadden's Health Restorium were getting almost 100% healings with their water cures, baths, enemas, fasting, and certain other simple healing methods, followed by carefully worked out diets of natural foods. One health doctor didn't lose a patient in 8 years. If the medical doctors had been as advanced as the drugless doctors, there would not have been those 20 million deaths from the medical flu treatment. There was 7 times more disease among the vaccinated soldiers than among the unvaccinated civilians, and the diseases were those they had been vaccinated against. One soldier who had returned from overseas in 1912 told me that the army hospitals were filled with cases of infantile paralysis, polio, and he wondered why grown men should have an infant disease. Now we know that paralysis is a common after effect of vaccine poisoning. Those at home didn't get the paralysis until after the worldwide vaccination campaign in 1918. So again, this is a first-hand primary source account of someone who lived during the Spanish flu. Now, obviously, at the time, the access to information wasn't as high. Surely Eleanor McBean can't have known what was going on in the entire world. It's, you could say that her experience was anecdotal, but typically, as seems to be obvious during COVID, anecdotal information is pretty good. It's an accurate assessor of a situation that is being alleged as affecting the entire world. Right? When COVID started, I told my parents that I said to them, we have about 30 people or more in our family, right? Cousins, aunts, uncles, and grandparents. If they're saying that there's a disease that has the incidence that they're claiming, then there is no explanation if none of us end up in the hospital. There is no explanation. And you can't tell me, and I'm not talking about positive tests or this or that, because we know what those, I've gone over in my book and on this stream to some extent. I could probably do more, what the story is behind those tests. But when there's an allegation of a worldwide pandemic, a family of 30 to 50 people is certainly a good assessor of the situation, of the severity of the situation. Not one person in my family was hospitalized. Not one. Okay? And so you look at these examples and you ask questions. And you say, how is that possible if we're in such a situation? Right? And none of them died. No one died. Not until after, right? Not until the vaccination campaign in our generation, in our age, which was meant to save the old people, did my grandpa get cancer again? Did it recur in him after 10 years of him not having had cancer? Once the vaccination campaign started, it recurred in him. So, and he unfortunately passed away shortly after. So, again, my assessment of what occurred is not going to be the same as someone who wore 2 masks. Because the truth of the matter is, for the most part, is that there really aren't many world scale events. Events are localized, issues are localized, and people through mass media turn them global. But unless you hear that point of view, right? Unless you hear my assessment, my experience, unless you hear the experience of other people, maybe there were people who lost loved ones. I know people who think COVID, the majority of, a lot of people I know, maybe the majority, think that COVID was a thing. But unless you hear the whole story from them even, you don't know what actually occurred. You piece these things together by taking it one person at a time. For example, of the people who I do know that went to the hospital, again, through I have to go multiple levels of people I know to find one. You just simply ask them, how did they get to the hospital and what happened once they were there? And every single time it's they weren't feeling right, they went to the hospital, they took remdesivir, right? Pretty much every time. And never mind the fact that of those cases, these people end up with all sorts of problems. But it's important to hear from people who don't necessarily their experience doesn't follow that at all of what is being claimed. And in the case of Eleanor McBean, as we saw, she apparently her family was running all around town during the Spanish flu, taking care of all sorts of people who were vaccinated against these diseases that they came down with, which, shocker, coincidence. I mean, you can decide if you think that's a coincidence or not. But they go around town caring for people, and they don't take anything back and get their kids sick. And again, you could say anecdote all you want, but anecdotes are what help you determine what history is. So I don't know. It seems to be that a lot of people think that scientific studies tell you history, which is nonsense. And I think that we've kind of proven that unless the two come together, you don't have an explanation of anything. You can make us. How many scientific studies exist today that just do not align with discernible reality at all? They say that something like 50+% of scientific studies can't even be replicated. And then on top of that, you have situations like, I think it was Dr. Andrew Hill and Dr. Tess Lowry, who Tess Lowry calls Dr. Hill on the phone about a study that was supposed to be done. He was supposed to be doing on ivermectin, and he admitted that the study that he was conducting was influenced by a charity organization that's affiliated with the WHO. Right? So I think it was called Unitaid, maybe some organization like that. And they said that the organization specifically, he said this, Andrew Hill's words on recorded audio, you can listen to it, that they had a hand in writing the conclusions. This is the organization that funded his study in the first place. So again, this is not sufficient as a means of determining what actually took place in history. And I think, for me, the fear, the concern with the prospect of not being able to, the prospect of people down the line not being able to have heard our side of the story, right? Which in the case of COVID was us being kicked out of stores and discriminated in all kinds of ways, made me feel like I needed to write a book about it. Because if I didn't document it, who was going to do it, right? I mean, some people did document it, but at the time I started writing it, it certainly didn't seem like it was going to happen. And so, yeah, let's talk about some other examples, though. I don't just want to talk about COVID, but it's just a really important example. The best one, I guess, in my point of view, because it's what inspired me to write history. And, if there's something similar to you, like, this is kind of my purpose here, is trying to convince you to write the next history book. My dad actually said to me the other day, he's like, you should tell the story of the Tesla carbon credit scheme. You should write that story next. And I was like, maybe, or you should do it, right? I mean, whatever is the thing that piques your interest, you should do it. And what inspired me to do that originally was not just COVID, but was the 7th book that I've published, not wrote. I didn't write this one, but I published it. And it was a memoir by my great grandpa that I published for my grandpa. And so, I mean, I have an ethnically Greek background. My great grandpa came to America from Turkey in the early 1900s. Specifically, he's Greek, but he came from Turkey because, I guess the Turks were trying to recruit him into their army to fight a war against Greece or something. And so he came here and wrote a book, a memoir, really short, not a full, a full-length book, but he wrote a story about his life coming here to America, what his life was like here in America, raising his kids, having all these jobs. And it was super intriguing. And I remember I was talking with Holy Quail Bear about the concept of time travel, which is hilarious because I actually had a podcast, or an episode I did a while back, like before my really while back, before I started re-streaming again, getting back into streaming. And I had a whole episode called like time travel is not possible. And the idea of that episode was like time travel in the context of the way they describe it in a movie isn't possible, because if I, like, let's say I create a time machine right now, right? And I travel ahead and I enter my time machine and I go forward 10 minutes and it brings me back to where I was when I created the time machine. Well, before I step into the time machine, I'm not here in the room with me. There's not two of me in this room, right? So if I went back to 5 minutes before, there wouldn't have been two of me in the room. And so that can't be the same timeline, right? It doesn't make any sense. There would have to be, like, you might be creating like a new timeline, I guess you could say. But time machine, as they say, where you go back into the past to influence the future, is absurd, which is absurd for me to talk about, right? Because, I mean, obviously, but it's just funny. It was just something funny to talk about, right? And so I do that episode, but I talked to Holy Quail Bear, and he was talking about this concept of basically like generational time travel, where you kind of pick up the mantle of what your ancestors left behind. Your soul basically picks up the mantle of what your ancestors left behind. And it was so fascinating because my great grandpa not only has the same first name as me, like I was named after him, but he wrote a book about his life where there were things in there that were so fascinating. For example, they had maybe a couple kids at the time, I think 3 or 4 or something, a bunch of kids. And he wrote about a conversation he had with his wife where she kind of didn't want to have kids anymore. She wasn't sure if she did or whatever. And he tells her, he's like, honey, I understand your concern, but this is what we need to do. This is what Jesus would want us to do. And you read that today and you would think, wow, what a different time. But he documents her reaction, and her reaction is just like, of course, yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I was wrong. I was being selfish. And am I saying that is the same way we would handle the situation today? Like the thing is, the difference is, I guess, is that, I get when The Handmaid's Tale people imagine that situation, they imagine her, resisting and him just, being abusive over it. But he wasn't abusive over it. He was just, describing what he believes. And it is accurate, right? We're here to create. We're here to be fruitful. And there are real concerns women can have with continuing to give birth. So if those, were there, then I'm sure they would have had more of a conversation around it. But it's just fascinating because the way that they describe that time today is not the way that conversation seems to have gone, right? Like his wife didn't wasn't furious at him, didn't have a particularly angry stance on it, didn't feel oppressed, none of that. They had a conversation about it, like two adults, and that was the feeling at the time. She was okay with it at the time. He was a loving husband, working multiple jobs to provide for his family. And so again, it's just interesting to me because this is a guy who, for the sake of future generations, wrote down his experiences. And it wasn't just, again, limited to that one conversation. But it helped me to see not just his point of view on it, but hers. And to see what the attitudes of the time period were like, because according to, according to everyone else, according to the attitudes of today's neoliberal degenerate fest, right? That would have made him a horrible person. And I don't think that makes him a horrible person at all today. But even by that standard, even by the standards of the time, his wife honored his opinion, agreed with it, saw, they were able to have a conversation about it. And it's just super fascinating to be able to kind of compare that time to today. And really, again, it's not to say that men or women are different today. The only difference is the willingness, mostly of men, to express their opinions, I think. I think that we live in a time where men, and I've been guilty of this in the past, are mostly cowards that won't say what they actually think, and won't, the most masculine trait there is the word no, is the saying the word no, is a stubbornness and a willingness to fight for what you believe in. And if it comes to it, die for what you believe in, but better if you don't, right? Better if you stay and build. But just a willingness to know what's right, to accept what's right, and to not compromise when you know what's right. And so it was just super fascinating, again, to contrast what you're told about that time with what you actually would have experienced if you were there, and to see it firsthand. And it's little things, right? That's not one of the things that I wished that there was more of. Part of me wishes there was more of, not wishes that was there instead, but wishes there was more of was like, what I wanted more about his experience in Turkey. Like what were all the circumstances that led to his decision to leave? What kind of things were they trying to make him do, and how did he feel like it was going to compromise who he was to stay there, right? I wish there was more of that, but at the same time, that's not the only thing you can get out of history. There are little things, there are attitudes, there are just the regular back and forth between people and what their perceptions are that can teach you about today, because you can understand what was going on there. And so in his case, that was super fascinating to me. And just to finish off here on this topic of history, I just want to talk about my favorite historian who really taught me how to write a history book. And that's Dr. E. Michael Jones. And the reason I bring him up is because I want to talk about the way in which he goes about approaching it, which aligns with what I'm saying about my great-grandpa, and looking at the little things that happen day to day in history that make up history, right? Because every day you vote, every day, whether you choose to participate in the current narrative or whatever, you vote every day. If someone is trying to impose something on you, you vote when you go along with it or you don't. And so that's what makes these little attitudes and actions and decisions so important and worth writing about, because you never know how that can influence you. You never know how maybe, how that relates to what's happening today. And what E. Michael Jones does such a good job of is to understand that today is history. I remember one of the most interesting lessons I've ever learned about history was when Dr. Jones talked about in 2019, okay, like at the end of 2019 into 2021, he talked about 2019 as the year of the battle for the internet. While it was happening. And it is so hard to conceptualize that you are living through history, right? And, you know, in the case of something like COVID, it's a little less hard maybe, but at times it's still difficult. At times it's still, you're just so focused on the stress and the points of view and all these things that it gets dizzying. And it's hard to see that later, like what's happening right now is going to have consequences. Every decision that you make, like I said, when you vote every day, is going to have consequences, not just on you, but on how people look back on what you did or didn't do. And in 2019, it was just a perfect example because really starting in 2016, maybe a little bit before that, and forward is when the social media censorship really started. And I don't mean reached, the point that it's at now. I mean started. I mean like when people who were being called bigots, who you agreed with were a bigot and justified them getting kicked off of a platform, were getting kicked off of a platform. When they invented this term called hate speech, that is an irrelevant term to an American. An evil term, a subversive term, a trick. Because again, I think I talked about this last episode, but sticks and stones, break your bones. But hate speech is something that makes idiots sad, right? And so they started moving to ban this type of thing as if that was a solution. Which really, again, I think I talked about last week. It was just, you're just banning yourself. And this really reached a kind of culmination in 2019 in particular, because there were I think that was the time maybe that was like right around the time when they were starting to like really censor Trump and stuff. And I think right after that, obviously, when the election happened, he got kicked off of social media. And so that was when what started out as skirmishes, right? What started out as attacks on people who they could afford to attack, who they could garner up enough justification to kick off, really got to a boiling point where they now had to start kicking off people who were more mainstream. And so it's, what started out, like I said, what started out as the E. Michael Jones and the Owen Benjamins and the people who they, could get away with calling a bigot, and for some reason people would agree because they don't even listen to what they're saying. I mean, think about when they kicked off Trump. Now, I'm not a Trump fan in particular. I thought he was funny for a time, and I tend to support, anyone who's a nationalist. But like Trump, he, gets kicked off of Twitter as the president of the United States. And not only that, it wasn't even just Twitter, because throughout his whole presidency, people might forget this, but like the mainstream news refused to air any of his speeches because they said they'd be giving a platform for hate or whatever. Think about that. Think about how crazy that is. I mean, the thing that makes me the most suspicious of Donald Trump is that he didn't do everything in his power to destroy those media. I mean, I understand that there's limitations, I guess, on what a president can do. But like, if it was a natural presidency, what those media companies were doing is it not treason? I mean, they're not showing you what the president said. That's attempting to overthrow the government, right? If Trump is actually the president, then that's an attempt to overthrow the government, and they were doing that. They weren't airing what he was saying. And if they're not airing what he's saying in a time when that's the public square, That's how, you'd connect with people. It'd be like if they were to shut off FDR, they wouldn't, the radio stations wouldn't air FDR when he was, what was he? Is he the one that was doing fireside chats? I don't even know. Whoever was doing the fireside chats on the radio. It'd be like if they were to say, no, he's espousing hate, which is ironic because if I'm right that was FDR, it was happening during a war. so you like literally would have been espousing sentiments of murder amongst the people. But I mean, it's just crazy. This is what was happening in 2019. And like I said, there was E. Michael Jones kind of just was the first person who really put it into context for me that like we live through history. People might have said that to me before, but it's hard to, especially when you're part of a community like, let's say the Bears, where you can't really see how big it is because it's on the internet, and you might see some of the more popular Bears, and there might be a decent amount of them that you know of, but it's when it's a small community like that, it's hard to think that people would look back on such a historic thing even be happening to them. They're being kicked off of payment processors and not able to communicate. This is crazy. This is discrimination that not long ago would have been viewed as only something that the worst regimes in the world would do, which is what ours is. But that's only for honest people to acknowledge. The rest of them are fine with calling people like that hateful and kicking them off and thinking they're just going to disappear. Well, they don't disappear. And thankfully, because they won't disappear, like Dr. E. Michael Jones, like me now, we're going to tell the history of what happened. And from our point of view, and people are going to benefit from that. Because again, when they look back on it, the same way I used to look back on things and think of them in the context of whatever the mainstream narrative was, when they look back on it, they're going to realize it wasn't like that. Necessarily, not for everyone at least. And the whole picture is the history. Right? The whole picture is the history. You understand the context of things through a collection of opinions. And in the case of today, right, they've censored so many people that it's become the majority of opinions. So at this point, maybe the history books will be our history books because we've persevered. But whether the history books, right, the ones that are in the schools are ours or not, we're putting it down on paper now. And that's a thing that when I first started writing fiction, I didn't ever imagine I would do. I didn't ever imagine in a million years that I would become a historian. I thought that writing was just something that I did for kind of fun. And I'm really glad I did take the jump. I'm really glad I did because it's opened my eyes to a lot of things, to how I understand the world. And I think that anybody who has gone through anything similar should write down their experience too, no matter how small it is. Even if it's like, I brought up the example of relationships before, but even if you've been through some kind of wild situation with like I could imagine in like a marriage type situation, right? Like my wife works as a paralegal, and even the context of two people, it would be so interesting, right, to take two people who are divorced's points of view and to have them write them down in a story type of format and make it like two separate parts of a book. Holy crap, I might do this. Like a fictional version I might do. But like, how crazy would it be if you had a book that was like part one person's point of view and part another who are getting like divorced? That would be wild. And it would be hard for me to put myself in that mind. It would be kind of a wild mindset for me to put myself in, but it wouldn't be necessarily so that I could glorify divorce. If anything, I could maybe make it look super like what it is, super horrible. But it would just be so fascinating because that would be the perfect kind of example, micro type of example, small scale example, where two people can look at the same event and just think the total opposite. Wow. I don't know if I'm going to do about divorce, but I'm really tempted now because I've been trying to think, what am I going to write about next? And I feel like that kind of a topic in fiction would be the coolest possible thing. Wow. Like in my other, I kind of already did something along those lines, right? With my Civil Land series, because it's got multiple points of view. But in that one, it's closer to like 5 or 6 points of view. So you do get that, right? Where, certain characters see certain events differently. So it's not like going to be totally new, because I have to account for that when I'm writing fiction and I'm writing multiple points of view. I have to be able to account for that the perception of an event would be different. Like, for example, in my Civil Land series, there's 2 different clans, right? And in one of the books, there's like an attack that happens to one of them, and one of them perceives it as necessary, and the other one perceives it as horrific, right? And so, but that concept in a more micro scale would be so cool, I feel like, and would, if I did it right, it might help people kind of see things from someone else's point of view and avoid those kind of situations. I don't know. It's not going to be like a self-help book if I do that, but it would be super interesting. I know that in what's that book about? They made it into a movie where Ben Affleck was in the movie. Oh, I don't remember. But the girl, like the wife, they think she's dead, and then she's not, I think. I think she fakes her death or something. I don't know. But half of that book, because I think I had read that book, and half of it is from his point of view, where he thinks she's dead, and then the second half is from her point of view. And so that's not exactly the concept I'm talking about, but it is in a way, because there's 2 points. Anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about. Again, if you really want to understand history at a bigger scale, like today I was kind of just talking about why it's important to document your view of history. And if you want to understand what happened in COVID history, buy my book Strangers in Fiction. But if you want to understand macro history, I think the best book ever on that topic is Logos Rising by Dr. E. Michael Jones. I mean, it literally is a history of ultimate reality. Like that's the subtitle, and it describes history from the beginning of time to today. Obviously, E. Michael Jones is a Catholic, so it's through a Catholic perspective. But even if you're not a Catholic, I think it's super valuable and kind of helps you understand how the things happening today, they echo through time, right? Just like the things that happened yesterday echo today. And I think it's one of the more underrated genres for the average person. I think that the average person looks at history and they think of school, which makes sense because that's, for most people, the only time that they read history. But I think that history actually, if you read an actual history book, and what I mean by that is one that's not afraid to mince words about anything, one that is not trying to make too many allegations about things, but is kind of documenting what happened and telling you about the perspectives of people who were there, no matter how hard they are to hear, right? And I don't mean they always have to be controversial, but they have to be honest, and they have to be complete. They can't be kind of watered down. I think the most interesting history books and the ones that I like to read now today are the ones that are not watered down, simplistic kind of explanations of things. Again, not necessarily controversial, but just not, you know, America believed in freedom, so they went and did the revolution. No, you know, I mean, maybe that was part of it, I'm sure. But like in E. Michael Jones' book Barren Metal, for example, he talks about how what the Stamp Act really was about, right? Which was the British were trying to use America as a way to pay off its debts, which you could probably, you know, that's not ultra controversial. It's not something that you maybe wouldn't be, you know, alluded to in a history class, but the context of it is pretty wild because even in the case of England at the time, their landed aristocracy were being basically their family homes were being taken from them over time because they kept getting into these debts and they had to pay them off somehow. And so they would sell off these estates, and if they had to, but for the most part, you know, they colonized in order to try to pay off these debts that they accumulated over time. And that part of the history to an American is not really there because guess what? They use us for debts too. Like they want to get us in debt too. So, you know, that's why I recommend books like Barren Metal. I've read Barren Metal and Logos Rising. I'm sorry, Dr. Jones, but I'm taking a slight, you know, just some time on you can call it a vacation, a mental vacation, because they're really big books. So I gotta diversify my library a little bit and give my brain a little break from all the thick gravy that's in those books. But for everyone else, Logos Rising is like one of the best history books I've ever read, and Barren Metal is a fantastic economics book. Also, honestly, probably one of the best economics books I've read. And again, Dr. Jones, just to round this off, right, understands how to put history in context, how to look at the little things that happen that lead to the big thing, what we perceive as the big things, because the big things are comprised of little plans that people make, right? Little attitudes that people have towards certain things. The battle for the internet was comprised of people like a comedian who said something that was too funny for people to be able to handle. People won't look at it like that. In the future, what that story will tell, because there will be a story. The amount of censorship that we've experienced in our time, there will be a story for it because it's too significant to completely ignore. So either they win. Well, it's not going to be one person wins or the other. You'll be able to hear histories probably of both, but you'll have to search harder for one of them, right? One of them will be harder to find. And the one that's going to be harder to find is either going to be theirs, which in my opinion is going to, if they lose, it won't even be hard to find. It just won't exist because of how evil it is, right? Which their point of view is that you just ban anybody who they disagree with. And even though they're the ones who lie about everything, right? The media lies about everything. Twitter, Facebook, these people who are on the narrative path, by nature of telling a narrative, lie about everything. So it's either going to be their point of view and the lies just continue, which could happen. I don't know. Corruption is something that I've decided is, you can't get rid of it. You shouldn't. It's like almost pointless to fight because you can't get rid. You can't fight it. You could just call it. You could just point at it, and all you have to do is point at it and say, "There it is," and that's how you kind of overcome it. But it's always going to be there. You can't eradicate it, and so because it's man's fallen nature, right? But what was I saying? We're almost done here. So anyway, what I was basically saying, I think, is that it's either going to be their narrative in the end or ours. And for different people, it might be different. For me, I have my assessment of the situation of COVID. Some people might read my book Maybe they'll, and then I think, in my opinion, they'll have a more rounded assessment of what happened, because there are things I don't make specific claims about, but then there's things that I do make I do submit my opinion about. And you just got to everyone's just got to use kind of discernment to decide where they fall on the spectrum. But overall, I think it's just really important to understand which situations you have most of the historical context on and which you don't. Don't be like Donald Trump, who says, that 100 million people died, and if only there were vaccines, which there weren't. And there were, okay, at the time of the Spanish flu, there were vaccines, obviously. Way before that, centuries. It had been around for like a century before that. But if you go into it without that kind of context, you're going to sound like you're lying, because part of it kind of sounds like he's lying. But yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to talk about that today because I ended up writing about it, and I just kind of wanted to put it into context of like what I got out of it, what I got out of writing about history. And I'll definitely do it again. I think I talked about on a previous stream that I might write a book about this poker controversy that happened, where it kind of seemed like this girl at a casino did a hero call recently, and it kind of seemed like she might have been cheating, like she might have seen the guy's cards, and there's all kind of speculation about whether the dealers were in on it and stuff. So that might be fun to write about. But yeah, history rocks. Okay, history is the greatest. And if you have a story to tell, if you have something that you feel like people aren't listening to you or aren't thinking about, I would consider doing that. It's not sexy to write a history book, but it's worth it. Future generations will thank you for it. I am grateful to my great-grandpa for telling his story, and I hope my grandkids are grateful to me for writing mine about what we went through for the past 2.5 crazy-ass years. Anyway, again, I'm going to wrap up now. I'm going to try to have Olive Tree on this week if I can. I'm going to have to try to figure out how to stream with him, but I will figure that out because it shouldn't be that hard. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it. Leave some comments below, and I'll see you next time. Have a good one.